4 men wandered the woods of Vietnam, all armed with M16 rifles. The group of men were of Australian origin and were very proud to serve their country, even more proud of their mission to bring peace to Vietnam. Although armed with M16s, the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment were resolved to only use them as a last resort. The 3rd Battalion were to merely patrol and search villages without destroying them, and attempt to convert the villagers through peaceful means. This band of 4 comprised of 22-year-old Private Hayden Edwards, who was quite the stout but well-groomed fellow, 19-year-old Private Fynn Lucas, who was tall, thin, and wiry, with an ever-present 5 o'clock shadow, 21-year-old Corporal Frank Dillon, who was of average stature and typically level-headed, quiet, and reserved. Last but not least was 25-year-old Sergeant Bailey McElroy, who was humble and could easily be mistaken for a bodybuilder. The band of brothers walked single file with Sergeant Bailey McElroy leading the group. The woods creaked eerily as the group walked, and Finn felt as if they were being watched, which made him nervous.
Is this the last village before we head back to camp and meet up with the rest of the 3rd Battalion, Sarge? 'Cause I'm getting hungry.
Finn Lucas said in a hushed voice, trying to calm himself. Bailey McElroy opened his mouth to reply, but shut it when Hayden Edwards spoke first.
Same here, Finn. I don't understand why we don't just bomb the Northerners with chemicals. It'd save us a whole lot of fighting, and we'd been home eating right about now.
Bailey shook his head as he trudged on through the woods, which were becoming more and more scarce as he advanced.
That's enough. Wait, didn't there used to be foliage here?
Sure enough, the area ahead of them was bare.
Yeah, there definitely was,
replied Frank Dillon. A feeling of unease took Finn as his mind tried to provide a solution for what could have destroyed the foliage.
Surely the Yanks didn't use...
Frank began, but paused out of shock when he saw the village. A dozen bodies of various ages, sizes, and sex lie on the ground. All of the bodies were bald, red, and blistered. It was as if the fires of hell had swept through the village itself. Arguably, they had.
Agent Orange.
Bailey stated with contempt in his voice. He unknowingly finished the sentence that Frank had started. Finn's stomach turned, and the contents of his last meal were at stake. As they tried to exit his mouth, he managed to fight it back down.
Oh God, we are being exposed to this stuff. Are we going to end up like them?
Finn managed with a shaky voice. Bailey shook his head.
No, not unless the Americans use more. We're going to split into 2 groups and search for survivors. Finn, I want you with Frank. Hayden, follow me.
Finn and Frank happened upon a small and ominous shack. Finn wasn't sure why, but he had the distinct feeling that something alive lurked inside. Finn slowly pushed the door open and cautiously stuck his head inside, hoping that whatever was present wasn't sinister and didn't take his head off. A bald, red, blistered woman was lying on a bed. She was nude and alone, and giving birth.
Oh God, go get Sarge.
Finn managed to Frank. Frank bolted out of the humble little shack, calling out for Edwards and McElroy. Hayden and Bailey peeked out of the shack they had just searched. They ran to Frank after they saw the coast was all clear.
Where's Finn?
He's fine, Sergeant. Finn's with a survivor. She's giving birth. God help me. I'm only 19. Push! Come on! Push!
A head and shoulders popped out. The skin was normal, and not blistered or red, as Fynn had feared it would be. Fynn gently grabbed the baby's shoulders and began to pull. The door to the shack opened, and Frank, Bailey, and Hayden entered just in time to see the rest of the baby come out. The torso slid right out, followed by another set of shoulders and a head. Fynn tearfully and carefully handed the fused, deceased baby to its mother. Both tears and hatred filled the woman's eyes as she looked up at Fynn. Her mouth opened as if to say something, but the words never came. Fynn reached down with his hands trembling and closed the dead woman's eyes. Although the woman hadn't spoken, Fynn knew that she had blamed him and the company he kept for the Agent Orange. This did not sit well with Fynn, who let tears flow from his eyes. The four men stood there, giving the deceased a moment of respectful silence. Bailey eventually broke the silence when he turned to Hayden.
This is why we don't bomb anyone until they surrender.
Hayden nodded in understanding as he wiped away a couple of tears. Rain fell from the sky as they exited the shack. It was as if the sky was weeping too. The group hurried back toward camp in the hopes of getting out of the rain and receiving hot meals. Those hopes were dashed for Sergeant Bailey McElroy when he was struck down by a loud but unseen assailant, a bullet. The bullet entered and exited through Bailey's neck. An ambush that consisted of 7 well-armed North Vietnamese had made it behind the Australians. Unbeknownst to the band that was once 4, but now 3, the Vietnamese had seen them leaving the village and had assumed that they were responsible for its destruction by Agent Orange.
Bailey!
Fynn exclaimed in a panic as he saw his comrade hit the mud with blood spurting from his neck.
There's nothing we can do for him, Fynn. We need to hightail it back to the camp. We're going to get slaughtered.
Frank shouted over the gunfire. The 3 raced for camp and their lives. Edwards had a considerable lead, followed by Lucas and then Dylan. The men hadn't made it far from where Bailey had died when Frank Dillon's right foot landed on a mine. The landmine exploded, tearing through and incinerating Frank's right leg as it spat shrapnel in all directions. Shrapnel from the landmine struck Fynn square in the back, causing him to fall to the ground in pain. Hayden turned around upon hearing the explosion and saw his comrade's predicament. Fynn picked himself up off the ground, trying to ignore the pain and pieces of shrapnel in his back as he advanced to Frank while firing his M16 wildly. Hayden followed Finn's example and doubled back toward Frank while firing his M16 at the North Vietnamese as well. 2 of the Vietnamese were hit by the random spray of bullets, which caused the rest to back off and seek cover. Fynn and Hayden took advantage of the ceasefire and helped Frank to his leg.
Frank, can you use your gun as a crutch?
Don't be daft, Hayden. He's going to bleed out if we don't get him back to camp quick.
Hayden reached into his left pant pocket and pulled out a handkerchief.
Hayden, that's not going to work.
It's better than nothing. Ought to slow it down.
Hayden quickly wrapped the handkerchief around Frank's stump and tied it off. No sooner had Hayden finished when the firing resumed. Fynn dropped his M16 in favor of Frank and slung him over his shoulder as he began to travel back to camp as fast as he possibly could, while Hayden laid down more oppressive fire. Every step was grueling for Fynn. Every step felt as if it could be his last. Fynn, Hayden, and Frank's struggle bore fruit as the camp came into view. The fruit became forbidden for Fynn as a bullet struck him in the head, causing him to collapse and drop Frank. Darkness approached, and despite Finn's best efforts to fight it off, he blacked out.
And that's how I lost my ear and got discharged, Doc.
The thin, bald, glasses-wearing therapist nodded and cupped his chin as the 64-year-old veteran of Vietnam, Finn Lucas, finished his tale. The therapist, Troy Lawton, had a long history of providing a listening ear for war veterans. "Did Frank survive?" inquired Troy Lawton. Finn scratched his patchy white beard in thought.
It's hard to say, Doc. I mean, he didn't bleed out, and he got discharged. But he's a completely different man. He spent most of his time since Vietnam kicking back tinnies. I'd argue that the Frank Dillon I knew died the moment he kicked that landmine. But then, I'd say that no one that participated in the Vietnam survived. We all suffered and lost one thing or another, sometimes multiple.
And what about Private Edwards?
I have no idea. When I was blacked out, the rest of the 3rd Battalion came out of the camp due to having heard the commotion, and they repelled the Vietnamese away. During that period of time, Hayden got hit and dragged off. Whether the bullet killed him, he lives, or was tortured and freed or executed, I do not know. Hayden was never found and is MIA to this very day.
The two men sat in silence for a couple of moments as Troy Lawton digested what he had been told. The only sound that could be heard was the ticking of the grandfather clock. "Have your sleeping habits improved?" Troy finally asked, breaking the silence.
No, I still don't get much. Maybe 4 hours. I hear M16s without fail when I shut my eyes. Rainy nights are particularly bad, but thunder is just the worst. I take that back. Noose choppers. Any choppers are. Every time I hear a chopper, I automatically flinch, and I start to lift my M16 only to realize that it isn't there.
You aren't alone in that, Finn. Many who come back from deployment experience feelings similar to yours. Tell me, do you feel any hatred toward the Americans for using Agent Orange?
Hatred? No. I was very angry at their military for the longest period of time. Years. I eventually came to realize that they weren't the monsters that I tried to make them out to be. Rather, they are just people who made poor decisions.
An alarm went off, signaling that the therapy session was over. I guess our time is already up. Will I be seeing you again, Mr. Lucas? I know you've had trouble finding a therapist that you found satisfactory over the years, but...
Yeah, Doc. I'll give you a few more sessions to see if you can heal me.
Finn cut him off as he lifted himself out of his seat. Finn made his way across the room, put his hand on the doorknob, and paused. Something wrong, Finn?
That incident with Agent Orange was 45 years ago, and that just got me thinking about what sort of weapons must exist now.